He walked in silently. No bodyguards, no poses, just sharp eyes like someone who's seen pride fall before the first blow is thrown. But when a martial arts master dared to challenge him, in front of all his students, Jason Statham's silence became the most powerful lesson that dojo had ever seen. You're about to see one of the quietest and most epic humiliations in martial arts history, and none of it was a movie. The polished wooden floor reflected the soft light filtering through the tall windows. The sound of bare footsteps echoed rhythmically through the silent space, like a wordless ceremony. Red and black belts hung from the walls, flanked by mirrors reflecting the sacred setting of respect and hierarchy. The dojo was more than a training place. It was the altar where ego disguised itself as discipline. In the center, a man moved with choreographed precision. His immaculate white uniform rippled with every turn. He was the master. His half-closed eyes left no doubt. In there, he owned time and space. His students, arranged in perfect lines, followed each gesture with reverence. The silence was absolute, broken only by the dry sound of feet against the floor and rhythmic breathing. But behind that measured order, something else pulsed, a dense energy. It wasn't respect, it was idolatry. The master didn't teach, he performed. Each demonstration was a spectacle. With every strike in the air, he sought not just perfection, but applause disguised as reverence. The student smiled, beamed, and watched with sparkling eyes. That room was a stage, and he was the undeniable protagonist. As the class went on, the door opened quietly. No one noticed immediately, but one student closest to the mat turned his head. Then another, and another, until the silence of respect was slowly replaced by the silence of surprise. Jason Statham stepped in slowly, as if not wanting to interrupt. He wore a dark jacket, a simple shirt underneath, and well-fitted jeans. His eyes, hidden behind sunglasses, scanned the room as if measuring each vibration. He didn't speak, didn't introduce himself, didn't greet anyone. He simply walked to a corner of the room, where there was enough space to observe, and stayed there. The master paused upon noticing the murmurs. He turned calmly, and his eyes met Jason's. A fine tension formed. It wasn't fear. It was something more complex. A collision of egos, one of which had no need to win. For a brief moment, silence gained weight. Jason removed his sunglasses with a calm gesture and placed them in his pocket. His gaze, now visible, was sharp as a blade, but without aggression. There was no disdain, just a presence that filled the room without saying a word. The master returned to the center of the mat. A deliberate pause. The students were too attentive for it to go unnoticed. Then, he resumed his movements, but this time with exaggerated gestures, unnecessary force, dramatic precision. He was no longer teaching, and he was performing, and everyone noticed. The students exchanged glances, restless, torn between fascination and discomfort. The master ended his sequence with a final pose full of theatricality, then lifted his chin. His eyes searched for Jason. It was an invitation disguised as provocation. Jason didn't move. The master stepped forward and began a speech. There was no microphone, but his voice filled the dojo. He spoke loudly, for all to hear. He lectured about movie men and real warriors, about how Hollywood created fake idols. His gaze was fixed on Jason, but his tone was for the students, as if to say, "See, he's just an image. I'm reality." Jason remained still, arms crossed, expression unchanged. A student in the front row shifted uncomfortably. Another discreetly raised a phone, sensing that something unusual was about to happen. The master then moved back to the center and began a new sequence. But this time, his strikes hit imaginary targets with theatrical brutality. His effort-filled grunts filled the hall. He was warming up for something, or someone. Jason uncrossed his arms slowly, a simple gesture. But in the silence of that room, it was like the beat of a drum before battle. The master now stood facing Jason, made a gesture, not with words, but with his posture. A beckon, a combat stance, a half-smile full of challenge. The students looked on in shock. Some held their breath. Others smiled nervously. They didn't know if it was a performance, a challenge, or madness. Jason watched for long seconds. His expression remained neutral. No vanity, no pride, just analysis. As if he were studying the dojo, the master, the students. Then, without dramatic appeal, he took a step. The sound of his shoe sole on the floor echoed louder than any shout. The master made space on the mat. Students instinctively stepped back, forming a circle. The silence was total. Even breathing seemed suspended. Jason walked to the center of the dojo, stopped a few feet from the master, looked around. The students' eyes were on him, fixed, hypnotized. The air's energy felt like a wire stretched to the limit. Jason took off his jacket with smooth movements, folded it calmly and handed it to a nearby student, then adjusted his posture. He didn't take a combat stance. He simply stood, firm, eyes fixed, arms loose at his sides. It was as if he were saying, "I didn't come to fight, but if I must." The master smiled confidently. He was the owner of the house, the stage, the eyes that watched. He raised his fists with trained elegance, took a step forward, and everyone held their breath at the exact moment Jason slightly turned his body, as if preparing for something no one expected. But before any movement was made, a sharp sound interrupted the tension. A student had dropped his staff. The dojo froze. The master hesitated. And Jason, still as a living statue, merely raised one eyebrow. The real fight hadn't even started. But something had already changed forever in that place. The staff was still rolling across the floor when silence reoccupied the space like a thick shadow. The student who had dropped it bowed quickly, embarrassed. But no one was paying attention to him. Every eye was fixed on the center of the mat, where two worlds stared at each other. Jason hadn't moved. His body remained still, but his presence vibrated, as if the very structure of the dojo was struggling to process an energy it didn't understand. The master, on the other hand, tried to maintain composure. His smile was no longer the same. There was a subtle tension in the muscles of his face, something only the most attentive would notice. It was as if his body was foreshadowing a truth his mind had yet to admit. The students exchanged glances. Many were anxious, others confused, some even afraid. The admiration they felt for their master was beginning, little by little, to give way to doubt. Jason hadn't done anything, and yet he had done everything. The master took a step forward. He wanted to show control, needed to reassert himself as the central figure. He assumed his traditional fighting stance, feet firm, fists raised, breathing calculated. He moved with elegance, flawless technique, but something was out of place. Jason remained motionless, as if time around him obeyed different rules. His eyes fixed on the opponent revealed more than strength. They revealed awareness, and the master felt it. With a gesture, the master signaled that a demonstration exercise would begin. It was a polite way to avoid the word challenge. After all, he still wanted to maintain the narrative that everything was educational. But the students knew, the entire dojo knew. This wasn't a lesson, it was a duel of essence. The master's first movements were quick. He approached with calculated steps, rotating his body in precise angles, delivering wide, beautiful, showy strikes, like a dance rehearsed 1,000 times. Jason moved for the first time. A sidestep, a slight tilt of the torso. No block, no formal defense, just a dodge. As if the strike had missed him on its own, the master stepped back slightly, surprised. Tried again. A spinning kick, technical, violent. Jason simply stepped aside fluidly, and before the foot returned to the ground, Jason had already repositioned himself. There was no impact, but the shame was already beginning to hurt. The audience grew restless. The sound of held breaths mixed with the light creaking of the floor beneath feet struggling for emotional balance. The master insisted, faster, more aggressive. He combined punches and kicks, used the space masterfully. But Jason seemed not to be there, or to be everywhere at once. His feet floated with stability. His expression was a mirror with no reflection. Untouchable. The master felt the sweat forming. Not from physical effort, but from exposure. He wasn't being overwhelmed by strength. He was being dismantled by control. Jason didn't need to fight. He simply existed, and that was enough to destabilize everything. The students were in shock. Some no longer hid their discomfort. The image of the invincible was beginning to crack. A student in the third row lowered his eyes, embarrassed. Another, once so confident, looked at Jason with quiet admiration. A third was recording discreetly, eyes wide at the elegance with which Jason dodged without seeming to move. Then the master tried something bolder, a secret move, a sequence reserved for special occasions, a fast, unpredictable attack with the potential to end it all. But Jason saw it beforehand, dodged before the strike even took form, and with an almost imperceptible pivot moved behind the master. And before he could turn, Jason lightly touched his shoulder with 2 fingers. It was enough to unbalance him. The master stumbled 2 steps forward. The whole dojo saw it and felt it. Jason didn't advance, stopped where he was, arms at his sides, as if nothing had happened. But the silence now screamed. The students were in shock. It was as if they had witnessed something sacred. What had once been idolatry now dissolved into true reverence. The difference was brutal and revealing. It was enough to unbalance him. The master stumbled 2 steps forward. The whole dojo saw it and felt it. Jason didn't advance, stopped where he was, arms at his sides as if nothing had happened. But the silence now screamed. The students were in shock. It was as if they had witnessed something sacred. What had once been idolatry, now dissolved into true reverence. The difference was brutal and revealing. The master turned, furious, and attacked again. A frontal kick, powerful, faster, more aggressive. Jason didn't retreat. Instead, he leaned slightly, dodging by centimeters, and extended his right hand. He grabbed the master's ankle with precision and held it, without force, just held it. The room froze. The master stood there, leg in the air, balance stolen, eyes in panic. Jason didn't knock him down, just let go. And the master fell on his own. The impact was dry, hollow. It didn't hurt physically. But what shattered in that sound was something much deeper. Pride. Some students instinctively took a step forward, but Jason raised his hand without looking at anyone. A subtle gesture, and everyone understood. The silence held. The master tried to rise quickly, but his body no longer responded the same way. He stood up unsteadily, sweating, breathing heavily. The pose was gone. Now he was just a man trying not to collapse in front of his audience. Jason walked toward him calmly, not threateningly, but with compassion. He extended his hand, not to strike, but to help. The master hesitated, and then, for the first time, accepted. Jason's hand lifted the master from the floor like someone lifting a past too heavy to carry alone. No words were spoken, no forced smiles, just silent respect. At that moment, the dojo split in 2, between what had been and what had just been born. A student fell to his knees, crying softly. Another began to clap slowly, unable to contain the emotion. In seconds, the whole dojo was divided between reverent silence and quiet tears. Jason then turned to the young student who had called him with his eyes. He walked up to him, and without saying a word, lightly touched his shoulder, nodding in a gesture that said more than any speech. You saw with your own eyes what true mastery means. But before he could walk away, the master called him, not with his voice, with a gesture, an unexpected invitation. Jason stopped, turned slowly. The master then knelt in front of everyone. And in that gesture, something ancestral was restored. But what Jason would do in response was yet to come. The young student standing in front of Jason trembled slightly, but it wasn't fear. It was reverence. There was something in his eyes that went beyond admiration, a silent hunger for truth. For the first time, someone in that dojo seemed to see beyond the white uniform, beyond the repeated techniques, beyond the master at the center. For the first time, someone saw Jason for who he truly was. Not an actor, but a man who carried mastery without needing to prove it. Jason looked at the boy for a few seconds, then turned his gaze back to the master. The entire dojo had come to a halt. The air felt denser. The other students, once motionless, now stirred uneasily, exchanging discreet glances, as if they sensed they were on the edge of something historic. Even the mirrors on the walls seemed more alert. Jason said nothing. There was no need. His hands were relaxed, but his body conveyed something ancestral, a silent firmness, as if every cell remembered battles won without noise. And with that presence, he returned to the center of the mat. The master, who until then had tried to control the narrative with his body, was now battling his own shadow. He breathed faster. His eyes lost focus easily. His posture was still correct, but soulless. Jason stopped a few steps away. His face was a sculpture of tranquility. Neck muscles relaxed, jaw loose, shoulders firm, but tension-free. It was as if he were preparing to listen, not to attack. The master attempted to regain control with a new offensive gesture. A rapid approach, fists raised, elbow in rotation. Jason responded for the first time, not with force, but with timing. A diagonal step, soft. A slight torso shift. The strike passed by him like wind. Then Jason pivoted his hips, just enough to reposition behind the master. And before the master could turn, Jason gently placed 2 fingers on his shoulder. It was enough to unbalance him. The master stumbled 2 steps forward. The entire dojo saw it and felt it. Jason didn't move forward. He stopped right there, arms at his sides, as if nothing had happened. But the silence. Now it screamed. The students were stunned. It was as if they had witnessed something sacred. What had once been idolatry now dissolved into true reverence. The difference was brutal and revealing. The master turned, furious, and attacked again. A front kick, powerful, faster, more aggressive. Jason didn't retreat. Instead, he leaned slightly, dodging by centimeters, and extended his right hand, caught the master's ankle with precision and held it, without force, just held. The room froze. The master stood there, leg in the air, balance lost, panic in his eyes. Jason didn't knock him down. He simply let go, and the master fell on his own. The impact was dry, hollow. It didn't physically hurt. But what broke in that sound was something far deeper. Pride. Some students stepped forward instinctively, but Jason raised his hand without looking at anyone. A subtle gesture, and everyone understood. The silence held. The master tried to get up quickly, but his body no longer responded the same way. He rose, staggering, sweating, breathing heavily. The pose was gone. Now he was just a man trying not to collapse in front of his audience. Jason walked toward him calmly, not in threat, but in compassion. He extended his hand, not to strike, but to help. The master hesitated, and then, for the first time, accepted. Jason's hand lifted the master from the floor like someone lifting a past too heavy to carry alone. No words were spoken, no forced smiles, just silent respect. At that moment, the dojo split in two, between what had been and what had just been born. A student fell to his knees, quietly crying. Another began to clap slowly, unable to contain the emotion. Within seconds, the entire dojo was divided between reverent silence and silent tears. Jason then turned to the young student who had first looked at him with admiration. He walked up to him, and without saying a word, lightly touched his shoulder, nodding in a gesture that said more than any speech. You saw with your own eyes what true mastery means. But before he could step away, the master called him, not with his voice, with a gesture, an unexpected invitation. Jason stopped, turned slowly. The master then knelt in front of everyone, and in that gesture something ancestral was restored. But what Jason would do in response was still to come. The master kneeling in the center of the dojo was an image no one had ever imagined witnessing. There was no theatricality in the gesture, no attempt to turn it into a lesson. He was simply a man, broken inside, stripped of pride, silently recognizing something greater than himself. Jason stood where he was, his eyes fixed on the master but his expression unchanged. He didn't need to kneel, didn't need to accept reverence, because he had never demanded it. Still, there was something powerful in that moment, something ancestral, as if an invisible hierarchy had just been restored. The students around them watched in silence. Some still tried to understand what they had seen. Others had already understood. It was more than a display of skill. It was the embodiment of a value that cannot be taught with words. Absolute control without the need to humiliate. Jason took a step forward. The light sound of his foot on the mat echoed louder than any scream. He approached the kneeling master. He didn't touch him, didn't speak. He simply bowed his head slightly in a gesture that seemed to contain centuries of wisdom. The master lifted his eyes. Tears welled there, but not of pain, of humility. For the first time, perhaps in his entire life, he experienced what it truly meant to surrender not to an opponent, but to a higher truth. Jason stepped back slowly. The dojo felt like a different place. Every detail of the room, the mirrors, the weapons on the shelves, the hanging belts, now seemed less like symbols of conquest and more like reminders of how much there was still to learn. Jason didn't return to the corner where he had stood before. Instead, he walked over to the group of younger students. He stopped in front of them. None of them moved. It was as if the air around him had become denser, more alive. He looked into each of their eyes, one by one, not with judgment, but with presence. And then, something unexpected happened. The boy who had taken the first step earlier, the one who had looked at Jason with admiration, knelt as well. Not like a disciple, but like someone who recognized a new reference. Others followed. One by one, the students began to kneel without instruction, without command, not as a form of blind veneration point, but to say, "I understand." They didn't understand techniques. They understood essence. They weren't admiring strength. They were recognizing mastery. Jason remained standing, breathing slowly, observing. Then finally he walked to the wall where spare uniforms were stored. He picked up a folded white GI. He didn't wear it. He just held it. He turned to face the kneeling students and walked to the center of the mat where it had all begun. The master, still kneeling, raised his face. His eyes met Jason's, and for a moment, there was a mutual understanding, as if both knew that this exchange couldn't be narrated, only felt. Jason held out the GI to the master, but the gesture wasn't symbolic. It was concrete, an offering of restart. The master took the uniform with trembling hands like someone receiving a gift more valuable than any trophy. He remained silent for a long time, then lowered his head, hugging the fabric to his chest. And for the first time since Jason had entered that space, the dojo smiled, not with open laughter, not with euphoria, but with a tangible peace, as if the entire place had taken a breath after years of holding it in. Jason turned to leave, but before taking the first step, a small hand lifted discreetly. The youngest student in the room. He looked no older than 10, shy, quiet. But now, wrapped in the kind of courage only truth can inspire. Jason looked at him curiously. The boy didn't speak. He simply walked toward Jason with short steps, and without saying a word, held out a small training notebook with worn pages and a torn cover. Jason accepted it. He opened to the first page. It was blank. The boy then pointed at the paper with a timid gesture. He wanted Jason to write something. Jason picked up a pen and with steady hands wrote only one sentence. Short, direct, but carrying the weight of everything that had just happened there. Then he closed the notebook, handed it back, and rested his hand on the boy's head for a brief moment. The child smiled, and that smile spread like a silent wave through the entire dojo. But as Jason approached the door, something unexpected happened. Outside, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. Voices in a raised tone. Someone was coming. Someone who didn't belong in that space, and with very different intentions. The dojo was about to be tested once again. The sound in the hallway grew louder. Heavy footsteps, sharp thuds on the floor, rough voices echoing with tones of mockery and impatience. The dojo door remained closed, but tension was already seeping through the walls like an uncontrolled electric current. Jason stopped just a few steps from the exit. His body froze and his eyes turned discreetly toward the master still kneeling. The master's expression changed. There was something new in it. Concern. But not for his own pride, for his students. The door burst open. 3 men entered. None wore uniforms. Generic workout clothes, shirts stretched tight over muscles and presences inflated with arrogance. They came from a nearby gym. Everyone knew they despised the dojo for its tradition. They always saw it as a place for old men hiding behind philosophy. They wanted physical proof, fast victory, an audience. The leader of the trio carried the posture of someone who believed himself invincible. He entered with arms crossed, eyes scanning the room, hunting for a target. The other 2 followed with slow steps, like unleashed dogs in foreign territory. They weren't there to train. They came to provoke. And when their eyes found Jason Statham, the atmosphere shifted. The leader smirked. Jason's presence didn't intimidate him. It provoked him even more. The muscles in his neck tightened as if preparing to display force. He walked across the mat as if it belonged to him, glancing around with disdain. No bowing, no respect, just provocation. The students still kneeling stiffened. The peaceful energy that had filled the dojo minutes ago was being threatened once again. Jason didn't move. The leader stopped in the center, where echoes of the last lesson still seemed to vibrate through the floor. He began to talk, using grand gestures and a showman's posture. He spoke to the students, to the master, to anyone who would listen. He mocked the dojo, its traditions, its bows, called everyone weak, passive, stuck in a useless past. But no one responded. Jason simply observed. The silence, once sacred, was now strategic. What had once been reverence was now defense. The students looked to Jason as if awaiting a decision. But Jason was not the master. He wouldn't give orders. He was the example, and he waited for them to decide what to do with it. The master stood up. His eyes met Jason's, and for a brief moment, a silent dialogue passed between them. Something about balance, about posture, about what truly matters. The master then stepped forward. With a calm tone, he began to speak to the intruders. The speech was not one of anger. It was firmness. He tried to explain that this space was one of respect, not confrontation. But the leader laughed. He turned to the other 2 and made a joke. Laughter echoed like poison across the mat. Jason remained still, but the entire dojo seemed to spin around him. It was as if everyone expected him at any moment to intervene, with the same level of control as before. But he didn't move. It was someone else's time to learn. The master took the center of the mat. He breathed deeply. His students watched him with more attentive eyes than ever. They no longer saw a symbol. They saw a man trying to be better than he had been, and that alone was already a lesson. The leader stepped forward, said he accepted the challenge, but his tone carried no respect, only mockery. They took position. The confrontation began, but something had changed. The master wasn't fighting to prove himself. He moved with precision, not to impress, but to protect. Each gesture was measured. Each movement carried meaning. He didn't want to defeat the other. He wanted to preserve the peace that had just been restored. And even so, strike after strike, he gained ground. The leader began to lose rhythm. His anger blinded him. His body was strong but not fluid. His attacks came with power but no strategy. And then, with a well-placed spin, the master unbalanced him. Without violence, just technique. The leader dropped to his knees. The laughter ceased. The other two didn't know what to do. The entire dojo was silent. Jason remained motionless, but now with a slight glimmer in his eyes. This wasn't spectacle. It was transformation. The master didn't gloat. He simply stepped back and gave the same slight bow he had given to Jason before. The lesson was repeating, in new bodies, in new ways. The three intruders stood up and left without a word. Not because they were thrown out, but because they no longer belonged in that place and not in the way they had entered. The students didn't move. Then the master turned to them. He didn't ask them to kneel, didn't request anything. And still, one by one, the students bowed, not before a title, but before the choice they had just witnessed, the choice to fight without needing to win, to teach without humiliating, to dominate without destroying. Jason walked calmly to the door. Peace had been restored, and this time not by him, but by someone who understood what needed to change. Before crossing the door, Jason stopped. Slowly, he turned one last time and saw something that surprised him. The boy, the youngest, was now in the center of the dojo, holding the notebook in his hands, open, and reading aloud the sentence Jason had written. Everyone heard it, but no one expected the effect those words would have on the master and on the boy himself. The boy stood at the center of the dojo. The worn notebook trembled slightly in his small hands, but his voice, despite its youth, carried a weight that silenced even the thoughts of those present. He didn't read in a hurry, nor with fear. Each word seemed to travel across the room as if being carved into the walls, the mirrors, the skin of everyone listening. The boy stood at the center of the dojo. The worn notebook trembled slightly in his small hands, but his voice, despite its youth, carried a weight that silenced even the thoughts of those present. He didn't read in a hurry, nor with fear. Each word seemed to travel across the room as if being carved into the walls, the mirrors, the skin of everyone listening. The phrase written by Jason stood alone on a blank page, and yet it filled everything around them. The strongest is not the one who wins with fists, but the one who masters himself in front of the world's eyes. Silence. Not the silence of fear, nor of tension, but the kind of silence that only exists when time seems to stop, because everyone understands something greater at the same time. The master looked fixedly at the boy. His eyes welled, not with sadness, but with a kind of clarity many never reach in their lifetime. For the first time in a long time, he saw himself as small, and that wasn't a problem. It was liberating. He approached slowly. Each step echoed like the closing of an era. He stopped in front of the child, knelt with respect, and placed his hands on the boy's shoulders. A simple gesture, but filled with deep meaning. "Thank you for reminding me what I had forgotten." The boy smiled. Jason, just a few steps from the door, watched everything in silence. There was something serene in his eyes now, as if this moment confirmed that his presence there hadn't been by chance, but by purpose. The students were still frozen, absorbing everything. Those who once looked only for strikes and titles now looked inward. It was as if the energy of the dojo had been irreversibly transformed. The master stood up. He breathed deeply, turned to his students. But unlike all other days, he didn't take the center. He gave no commands, corrected no stances, spoke no words about honor. He simply bowed. A full bow. No need for control, no ego. And everyone understood. It was a new cycle. Jason then took a step, and another. He walked toward the door with calm, light steps. There was no rush, only closure. Each movement was a wordless farewell. All eyes followed him, as if witnessing an eclipse, something rare, impossible to look away from. At the door, he stopped, turned one last time. The boy still held the notebook. Their eyes met. Jason gave a slight nod, and the boy responded with a shy smile, the kind of smile that can't be taught, only felt. The master stood among the students, without trying to regain leadership, without imposing himself. For the first time, he was part of the formation, and that made him greater than he had ever been. Jason then crossed the door. The light of the late afternoon illuminated the dojo's entrance, casting a golden outline around his body. Outside, the world went on. Cars passed, people talked, the wind blew. But inside, time had changed. The students remained silent for a few seconds after his departure. Then, without anyone saying a word, they began to tidy the dojo with a different energy. There was no rush, no agitation. It was as if each of them knew something precious had happened, and they didn't want to break it. The master gently picked up the boy's notebook. He ran his fingers over the worn cover as if it were something sacred. He returned to the page with Jason's phrase. And there he remained for a few moments, just looking, breathing, relearning. Hours later, when the dojo was already empty, the master was still there, alone, sitting in the center with the notebook on his lap. The silence of night no longer bothered him, because now he understood the true sound of transformation, not the sound of a strike, but the echo of a choice. The master thought that strength was shouting, that domination was imposition. But today he learned that true mastery is not announced. It silences the entire room. If this story touched you, leave a like. Share it with someone who needs to understand the difference between ego and discipline. And comment below. Do you think you would have the courage to face Jason Statham? And of course, if you love real stories that seem like movie scripts, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because there are still many powerful lessons coming.